Hello. I'm going to read a speech that I wrote for my class last week. So I'm taking a class called The Ethics and Theology of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this was one of our first major assignments beyond our weekly discussions. So I'm going to read you my speech today, a speech that I wrote for my class. If you are here, I'm happy to see, but I won't be interacting. I will be reading the speech and then I'll be saving it. So if you are watching this as a replay, thank you, and I hope you enjoy. Nonviolence, a revolutionary way of life and a way of love. Nonviolence is more than a tactic. It's a way of life and a way of love. It is rooted in a love ethic, a revolutionary way to live. It's a way of peace, a way of shalom, justice, and a way of wholeness and liberation. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrated the way love, power, and justice worked together. Nonviolent resistance is an extension of this lifestyle. It refuses to hate the other and treats the adversary as a fellow image bearer, opening the door to build a bridge for conciliation. According to King, love is the most durable power in the world, end quote. It was a driving ethical force and theology behind his entire commitment to a lifestyle of nonviolence. He emphasized often that it was courageous and far from impotent. King drew from the Greek word agape, rooting into a powerful spirituality of love, defining it as the love of God operating in the human heart, end quote. He continued saying, quote, "It is an overflowing love which is purely spontaneous, unmotivated, groundless, and creative," end quote. On the very next page, he affirms, quote, "Agape is not a weak passive love. It is love in action. Agape is love seeking to preserve and create community," end quote. This love is courage in action. Again, King says, quote, "Love is the key that unlocks the door of ultimate reality," end quote. And in the words of Paul from 1 Corinthians 13, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. This verse sums up the heart of a Kingian ethic and philosophy, and Gandhi's too. A brief history of the philosophy of nonviolence demonstrates its versatility in many different contexts, from the Sermon on the Mount to the Black Lives Matter movement today. When Mohandas K. Gandhi studied law in London, he was introduced to the New Testament and enamored by the Sermon on the Mount. This influence can be seen throughout his work repeatedly. His journey towards nonviolent resistance began in South Africa as a young lawyer turned activist, where, for 20 years, beginning in 1893, he led to helping South Indians fight against discrimination in South Africa. South Indians arrived as indentured laborers to work in sugarcane, and as their contracts expired, they settled and their numbers grew. They settled in the former region of Natal in South Africa. Gandhi helped to form the Natal Indian Congress in 1894, a year later, to represent this growing group. After he experienced discrimination firsthand, Gandhi found additional inspiration from the economic to the political spheres, including the parable of the workers in the vineyard from Matthew 20 regarding equal pay, which he discovered via John Ruskin and others like Leo Tolstoy, with whom he corresponded. Gandhi's influence on Dr. King was profound. Howard Thurman, a peer to Dr. King, King Sr., met Gandhi. Let me restate that. Howard Thurman, who was a peer of King Sr., Thurman met Gandhi in 1936 on a global pilgrimage, the Pilgrimage of Friendship, and Thurman's work deeply influenced King Jr. According to Gandhi's secretary, the friendship delegate of 4 asked Gandhi about the yogic concept of ahimsa, and Gandhi described it as more positive than electricity and more powerful than ether. Ahimsa, in Sanskrit for non-harm, was sometimes interchanged with the idea of satyagraha, which I'll define in a moment. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and wife, Coretta Scott King, would later spend 1 month in India from February to March in 1959, and he wrote about this in his piece called My Trip to the Land of Gandhi. Most notable to me, personally, is the connection between yoga's application as a science of liberation and social justice through the 8-limbed path of yogic philosophy, including ahimsa, which means non-harm, and satya, which means radical truth. And this comes from my teacher, Susanna Barkataki. Gandhi's term satyagraha, which he defined as truth force, draws on these yogic concepts into a word that means truth force. And King also referred to it as soul force. Both yoga and a Christianity that embraces the way of love are spiritual and embodied lifestyles. And these parallels are common denominators. These parallels and common denominators are instructive. Sorry, it's a little windy. My yoga practice nourishes and enriches my Christian faith. I'm getting all tongue-tied. Excuse me. Next section. Why do we need nonviolence? To answer the question of why we need nonviolence as a lifestyle, Dr. King is clear. We have a choice before us. Chaos or community. In his words, nonviolent coexistence or violent annihilation. While King wrote that in the context of a threat of nuclear annihilation in his time, this year in the United States of America, insurrection, overt and covert white supremacy, the threat of war and nuclear violence remain. We are in a moment of awakening to the reality and consequence of unbridled nationalism and white supremacy's evil influence in churches in this nation, in addition to its influence in wellness and New Age communities. Far too many of these churchgoers are trigger happy and using their nationalism or duty to patriotism to bypass the truth of a non-violent Christ. Our children participate in safety drills in anticipation of school shootings. Children at the border are placed in harsh conditions. Families have been separated for seeking a legal process of asylum with no clear process to move forward, trapped in the midst of dehumanizing policies. They too are our children. Housing costs stress even the average person. This pandemic has unveiled all manner of inequities, a tragic lack of concern for others. King urges, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, adjust to new ideas, remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. We must face the reality that hate begets hate, and now is a time when we must stand together for the good of all humanity. Choose to refuse hate and instead embrace a love ethic. It is time we consider nonviolence. Howard Thurman warned of 3 hounds: fear, deception, and hatred. The hound of hatred is a poison that harms both parties involved. We can refuse to dehumanize and turn others refuse to dehumanize and turn others into enemies. We can see the humanity, the image bearer within, and call it forth. Just as the song Know Who You Are at the end of the 2016 Disney feature film Moana depicts. I know who you are, Moana declares as she calls the violent, volcanic, lava erupting Te Kā back to her true self. Te Fiti, rolling green hills, flowers burst forth as she is now full of life. Refusing to hate is vital, both Thurman and King urged, for the sake of your own dignity and the sake of your soul. Thurman recognized the suffering of Black folks during his day and felt that even if they lacked agency over their external circumstances, they could always have their dignity, their self-respect, and moral agency. This choice is possible, but first, Thurman says, the soul must be revitalized and brought to life. This life brings self-respect, dignity, the ability to hold one's head up, to remember who you truly are. Will we recognize the dignity of every human as an image bearer of the divine? Will we see through the eyes of agape love? In Lisa Sharon Harper's book, The Very Good Gospel, she says, if humanity is created in God's likeness, then the way we exercise our dominion, our stewardship, should reflect God's kind of dominion. This looks like making room for the well-being and the common good of all, including creation and governing structures. To diminish another is to crush the image of God. Will we reunite families separated at the border and honor their humanity by making paths for their liberation and wholeness? Will we honor our neighbors by wearing our masks and being careful so we can put an end to this global pandemic? Questions. Part 3. How to live a life of love and nonviolence. How do we do this? How do we live and practice a life of love and nonviolence? First, make a conscious decision to live love. Choose the way of love. Align with love. Discern with love. I ask myself, am I aligned with love? Is this in alignment and agreement with love? It takes practice. Keep at it. Dismantling harm is the goal, not perfection. I have made love the central discernment question of my life. Is this decision in alignment with love? Am I in alignment with love? These simple questions help guide and reorient me to the way of love. Not perfect, just a practice. Second, we must lay down our weapons. Guns, swords, and words. We must guard our tongues, guard against manipulating and wielding our powers and privileges for our own benefit. Instead, leveraging our privilege for the greater good. King would say, the last shall be first in his drum major for justice. We must not use scripture as a weapon, for it is abusive and thus violent to do so. Lay real weapons down and take care of the children in our schools so they can learn without threats of violence. As we consider the technology and devices at our disposal, King understood the dangers of a different kind of technology. He said, our moral and spiritual lag must be redeemed. When scientific power outpaces moral power, we end up with guided missiles and misguided men. He may not have been referring to social media at the time, but we not just witnessed how dangerous it can be when wielded as a weapon, instigating insurrection and embedding lies, denying election results, an entire presidential administration driven by lies. Thank God for grassroots organizing and the will of the people to get things back on track. Third, learn to name your own needs. Listen to the needs of others. This is the key of nonviolent communication. It's also a book by Marshall Rosenberg. Lastly, practice the art of self-compassion. In learning to love well, don't exclude yourself. Tending to your own needs is a habit that will overflow onto others around you, and avoid resentment. Self-compassion will open you up to be compassionate and loving to others. Finally, take note of your core values and take time to define them and determine how you will choose to live. While you're there, is there room for everyone in your list of values, or are you purposefully denying other people's dignities to make their own choices? Is there room for immigrants and people who don't look like you? Are you willing to make space for the people you would point at and call names? Is there room for the queer cousin? Is there room for the women who would prefer you stay out of and stop judging their reproductive decisions? Take the time to ask, who is missing? Whom might I be dehumanizing with my choices? Practice listening, empathy, and more listening. King urged us to, quote, learn to live with each other in peace. And to do that, we've got to learn to get along and distinguish between dehumanizing words and actions and disagreements. James Baldwin said it plainly. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity. Ultimately, it is a choice. How will you choose to live? Will you choose the way of love? Let it begin with me. That's it. I do have a commentary I wrote about, but you don't need to hear that. Thank you for listening. I'm going to end this here. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. I appreciate you for being here, and go with love.